Well, good day everybody, and welcome to Lecture 8 as we journey through the wonderful Gospel of Matthew. Today we're looking at chapters 23 to 25, the second last of our time with Matthew. And I'm calling this one the Great Judgment Discourse. There is a bit of an argument about how to divide these three chapters, 23, 24 and 25. It's where Jesus is continuing his teaching on this great Tuesday before the Passover. But I rather like the New International Bible Version with Eugene Boring. He gives us a structure where he argues that the whole of these three chapters belong to a final discourse of Jesus centered on judgment. A judgment on the contemporary synagogue, chapter 23, and a judgment, the coming judgment, and how to cope with that, chapters 24 and 25. And he would say that this long discourse, these three chapters, correspond to the great long discourse at the beginning, the Sermon on the Mount. There's a bit of a balance there. And it also say that just as there were blessings in the Sermon on the Mount, beatitudes, so in this one there are woes to counterbalance the blessings. So there's something about what he says that appeals to me. However, most of the commentators, it must be said, reserve the title of the Judgment Discourse, sometimes called the Eschatological Discourse. It's a beautiful word, isn't it? Eschaton is the Greek word for the end times. What's going to happen at the end of the world, sort of stuff. So that's what the eschaton, the eschatological discourse is all about. Okay, so I'm going to look at two major things. The first one is judgment on the present, chapter 23, and then judgment on the future or the coming judgment, chapters 24 and 25. And each of those two judgments of our present time and the coming judgment will have three sections. In this first one, judgment of the present, the three sections are: there are warnings about the Pharisees. Why Pharisees? Well, again, the Pharisees in the synagogue are the chief group that the Jewish Christians with Matthew are sort of arguing with. Then there are the woes against the Pharisees and their way of following the Torah. And the final thing, the third final thing, is the lament over the city of Jerusalem. Okay, let's look at the first thing, some of those warnings against the Pharisees. We know that after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, a good generation after Jesus, and with it was destroyed the priestly aristocracy and the Sadducees, it was only the Pharisees who managed to keep Judaism going and flourishing. And they extended the priestly code to the whole nation, so that every Jew had to follow the rules that formerly the priests followed, because now we are a priestly nation. The priesthood resides in all of us, so we must keep all those rules, which meant that, of course, many Jewish people felt burdened. Will they lift a finger to lift these burdens? Not they. And we remember Jesus saying that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. The second thing about the warnings about the Pharisees come from this other fact that when the Pharisees tried to get Judaism continuing after the catastrophe, they tended to emphasize some of the externals, such as the phylacteries they wore and so on. And the reason was because What did they have to cling to? What defined them as Jewish people? And so the external things tended to be boundary markers and symbols of who we are as Jewish people. As for Catholics, a generation or two ago, not eating meat on Friday was a boundary mark or a symbol for us. So the Pharisees tended to emphasize some of the externals, and we see it here in this passage. Matthew is saying that they focused on the externals, being impressive and so on. And the externals that he mentions are the phylacteries, and the phylacteries are the little leather box that they had on their foreheads and strapped to their arms when they were praying. And those little leather boxes had passages from the Old Testament in them. They also had, he talks about the fringes on their prayer shawls, and sitting in the front seats at the synagogue. If you're sitting at the front seats, you're actually looking at everybody else, and you look quite impressive, of course, sitting in the front seat. Also talks about titles. And of course, as Matthew's looking at this, he sees the Jewish, the Pharisees really focusing on externals and losing the heart of it all. But he also says this incipient clericalism, if you like, is not going to happen amongst us. It cannot happen amongst us. And what he is ultimately saying is, we've got to have humility. The great warning about the Pharisees is, we've got to have humility. Learn from me, from gentle and humble in heart. Whoever humbles himself like a little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So the second thing now in this first big chapter are the woes against the Pharisees. And it's pretty strong stuff. And people say, no wonder the early church was anti-Semitic, and a history of anti-Semitism is within Christianity. But we'll take another little bit of a look at this. It's really a caricature of a group, of this group, who were trying to resuscitate Judaism and keep it going. And they're the enemy, if you like, of the early church. And in many places in Palestine, you can see one village had a synagogue, another had a church, and so on. And the Pharisees themselves actually disliked hypocrisy. But it's Matthew, not Jesus, who's speaking. We've got to remember that. Matthew is facing the church of his day and the struggles of his day. And the strong language that he uses is common in polemical writing at that time and right through until almost our day. The 19th century, polemics is just as terrible sounding as that. So these woes, what are they? They're a form that prophets used to use, a way of speaking. Blessing on this person, woe on that. There are 7 woes in Luke, but they're radically transformed by Matthew. And hypocrisy is not so much being phony, like what you say isn't what you live, but it's rather being inconsistent and godless. It's lacking the real dimension of everything, which is God. And that's what's, we're trying to worship God by the way we live. And that's what was disliked. So, I'll just look at 3 of them briefly. You've taken the key of knowledge so that people can't get into heaven. Heaven is shut. If you remember that Matthew gave the keys of the kingdom to the disciples. So what he's saying in this about the Pharisees is that they keep heaven shut from others because of the way they live. Whereas the better way to live is to follow God's will